program has been a long time in coming. In 2019, when I first joined the Wayside Foundation, then as a trustee, I began searching through documents in our archive for information about the history of this site's Indigenous inhabitants before contact and during the early period of English settlement. And I found very little beyond Alfred Serrano Hudson's 1889 History of Sudbury. But having read other books and short histories of Indigenous populations from the historical societies of surrounding towns, like Framingham and Marlborough, I knew that there was information out there. And a more comprehensive history that included Indigenous history, we realized would require visits to other libraries and archives. We then decided that what we needed was a researcher with a grasp of local history and experience finding and analyzing new source material. And we landed upon the idea of hiring a scholar in residence to focus exclusively on the Indigenous history of the Wayside Inn historic site before and during the 17th century, to gather as many resources as possible and report back to us on their findings. It was also an opportunity to use a portion of our Fund for Diverse Programming to further the fund's goal of probing deeper to unearth new voices to tell the stories of our site. We were fortunate to have a public historian of the caliber of tonight's speaker answer our job posting. He is not only an accomplished writer and researcher, but also curious-minded and has been a true collaborator with us. On that note, I would like to introduce Richard Smith. Richard has lectured on and written about United States history and 19th century American literature since 1995 and worked as a public historian in Concord since 1999. The author of 6 books for Applewood Books, he is the current scholar in residence for the Wayside Inn Foundation. So without further ado, I hand the floor over to you, Richard.
Hello, how are you? Nice to be here this evening. Thank you so much for having me here for this talk. And I'm very impressed with the numbers that we have. Thank you for everyone from all across the country for joining us. And let's begin. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral and unceded homeland we live, work, and gather. The Nipmuc, the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag. We acknowledge their ancestors as we seek to understand and remember the painful history of war, genocide, and forced removal of Indigenous peoples by European settlers. Tonight, we gather as a living celebration of the Indigenous story, a story that is not just part of the past, but is an ongoing part of our present and future as Indigenous communities continue to live and make new history here. May we all make a commitment to deepen our relationship with Indigenous communities as we work to be their allies in the ongoing search for truth, justice, and understanding. While I myself am not Native American, I am pleased to be sharing this history, and I will do my best to honor them. In 1620, a group of separatist Puritans that we now call the Pilgrims landed in what is now present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts. Boston would be founded in 1630, while out here on the frontier, Concord would become the first inland settlement in 1635. 3 years later, Sudbury was founded. It was incorporated a year later with a permanent population of about 130 men, women, and children. And that, in the minds of many, was the beginning of Sudbury's history. But there were people here before 1638. So why don't we know much of their story? In 1835, about 200 years later, Ralph Waldo Emerson, giving an address on the 200th anniversary of Concord, regretted the lack of Indigenous voices when it comes to the founding of Massachusetts. He said, quote, "The worst feature in the history of those years is that no man spoke for the Indians." And in 1844, Henry David Thoreau, a lifelong student of American Indian lifeways, wrote in his journal, quote, "The Indian is absolutely forgotten, but by some persevering poets. The white man has commenced a new era. What do our anniversaries commemorate but white men's exploits? For Indian deeds, there must be Indian memory. The white man will remember his own only. And that is the main problem when you are a historian dealing with the story of America's indigenous peoples, the lack of, as Thoreau put it, Indian memory. As we all know, native tribes, for the most part, did not have a written language. So almost all of what we know from the written record about the indigenous people of the 17th century comes from the white man's point of view. And more often than not, the written description of and commentary about the natives is less than flattering. For instance, I found this in an early history of Sudbury, quote, "The tawny serpents attacked in a monstrous manner at night, in the rain, during harvests, over the snow, recognizing no standards of warfare as understood by Europeans. They seemed as ready to slit the stomach of a pregnant woman as they were to scalp any man who crossed their warpath." Or I also found this from a 19th century history of Framingham, Massachusetts, quote, "Aside from war and games for the young men, an Indian was averse to everything that required bodily labor. He trapped and hunted only when necessity compelled him. It was the duty of his squaw to supply him with food. It was only when her stores failed that he would go hunting. His idea of true dignity and true happiness was to bask in the sun or over his fire, smoke his pipe, eat to repletion, and doze." Too often, our Native American forefathers and foremothers are only remembered in European histories as caricatures of the real people who lived in Massachusetts prior to European contact. If they are remembered at all, it is for horrible deeds that occurred during warfare, or if they are honored, it is usually as the racial stereotype of a noble savage because they helped out the settlers in one way or another. Either way, the historical memory of our indigenous people is often cartoonish and demeaning. What I would like to do in this talk is to tell the history of the Native people of Sudbury and honor them as people and not as mascots or as boogeymen. For good reason, we remember people with the names of Howe, Rice, and Wadsworth, but that is only part of Sudbury's history. Tonight, I'd like to flesh out the story a little bit more. It is estimated by some historians that in 1600, the indigenous population of New England was somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 people, while others believe that it was 60,000 to 75,000. Of course, we will never know exact numbers, but what we do know is that the native population lived all across New England in settled villages, had their own tribal governments, hunted and fished the wildlife, and cultivated the land with corn, beans, and squash. And Katina, if you could show the map of New England from the 17th century, please. I got this map actually from the Nipmuc Nation website, and that gives you a pretty good idea of the tribal areas that I'm talking about this evening. Of course, these areas were fairly fluid from time to time, but this is generally a pretty good idea of the areas that we're talking about and the nations that were involved. And the area that I'm talking about is pretty much smack dab right there in the middle, in between the words Massachusetts and Nipmuc. The languages spoken by the people of what is now Massachusetts belong to the Eastern Algonquin language group, and these tribes included the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Pennacook, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Quinnipiac. All southern New England tribes spoke languages related to the, quote, Eastern Algonquin family. Speakers of one Eastern Algonquin dialect could generally converse in the one spoken by their neighbors. For instance, the native language of the Nipmuc people was a dialect of the Massachusetts. But it is important to remember that while the white man designated these tribes as, quote, Eastern Algonquin, none of these tribes knew that they belonged to the, quote, Eastern Algonquin linguistic group. And as an aside, the Algonquin language group should not be confused with the Algonquin tribe of Eastern Canada. For my purposes this evening, I'll be looking primarily at the Nipmuc peoples because the land where the Wayside Inn now sits was once part of their ancestral land. Translated, Nipmuc means freshwater people, and they lived in villages throughout the area, subsisting on seasonal hunting, gathering, and farming. According to the Nipmuc History website, Nipmuc villages were linked together through kinship and trade with peoples of other indigenous populations. Like many of the other Native American groups, the Nipmuc population severely decreased after European contact in the 17th century because of disease, war, and displacement. But just prior to white colonization of Massachusetts in 1620, it is estimated that there were about 6,000 Nipmucs in Massachusetts, with as many as 40 villages scattered across the interior of the state, including places known as Wabaquasit, Quinnebog, Quabog, Pocumtuck, Agawam, Squaqueag, and Wachusett. Those were all villages. After 1647, the main village for the Nipmuc Nation was called Hassanamisco and was centered in what is now Grafton, Massachusetts. This was a village created by the Reverend John Eliot, the man who was responsible for Christianizing hundreds of Native peoples living in Massachusetts. And Hassanamisco was a town of praying Indians, quote unquote, who belonged to the Nipmuc tribe. I'll talk more about this later. The Nipmuc formed alliances with nearby tribes such as the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Narragansett, and Mohegan, and relations with these tribes were generally good. It seems that inland Native groups did not deal with the fierce territorial competition that existed between tribes on the Massachusetts coast. And it appears that the Nipmuc were organized into a loose confederation or alliance of related villages that acted independently in their daily lives and activities, but they made major decisions as a tribal unit when faced with situations on a regional scale, such as warfare. Now, archaeological digs indicate that the Wayside site was occupied by peoples who were either trading with interior groups for raw materials or people who were migrating through the area and were carrying their native raw materials with them. There were stone artifacts recovered in the Wayside in the 1970s that indicate native occupancy here. And historians estimate that Native peoples were on this site for at least 2,000 years, from about 1000 BC to European contact. Now, Katina, if you could please show the pictures of the artifacts. So the archaeological dig took place in the early 1970s. The report came out in 1975. And some of the artifacts that they found were a late archaic period spear point. There's a picture of one of them there, made of smoky quartz. There were also flakes of falsite that showed that they'd been worked on by the native population. And there was also a complete spear point of quartzite, which dates to the late woodland period. So there were people living on the Wayside site. Now they were here at the Wayside site because of the proximity to the Sudbury River. Hot Brook and the nearby swamps and marshes were also important. In the springtime, the swamps and marshes yielded a much greater variety of edible plants and animals that either the forest or the river could provide. According to the Wayside Archaeological Report, quote, such a rich and easily exploitable resource would not have been overlooked by the natives, unquote. Large game animals were an important food source for the Nipmuc, but they relied even more heavily on plants and fish as they moved seasonally between fixed villages to exploit these resources. There's a picture of another spear point that was found at the Wayside. Along with the fish, reptiles, and amphibians that were used for food, naturally growing wild rice was also cultivated for their diet. The people navigated the waterways in dugout canoes called mashoon by the Nipmuc. Trees such as black willow and marshy plants like reeds and cattails could be used for housing, bedding, clothing, and basket making. Clay from the swamps and rivers was ideal for pottery, and the hides of large game animals like deer and moose were also used for clothing. Like many of the eastern tribes, Nipmuc women were the farmers who harvested corn, squash, and beans, and also gathered nuts and fruit, while the Nipmuc men did most of the hunting and fishing, using bow and arrow and spears. Fishing was also done with the use of weirs, which were interwoven baskets placed in tidal flats wholly or partially across a river in order to trap shad, alewives, and even salmon. One notable weir was uncovered along Boylston Street in Boston's Back Bay area in 1939 during construction of the Green Line subway tunnels. And the Nipmuc, we know, were just one of the tribes that fished in what is now called the Back Bay. The Nipmucs traded with other tribes of southern New England, including the Narragansett, Wampanoag, and Mohegan. However, relations with other tribes were not always friendly, and there were often disputes with other nations, such as the Pequot of Connecticut. The best known site in Sudbury with a Native American connection is called Knobscot Hill. The area first appeared in the Puritan records by the Nipmuc name Penobscot, meaning place of the falling rock, and was later shortened to Knobscot. It's believed that Knobscot was a spiritual place for the Nipmuc people, and there was also a large stone cairn at the summit, which possibly served as a lookout for the native people. According to local histories, a Nipmuc medicine man named Tadtamaus, also known as Old Jethro, and his son, Peter Jethro, as well as 12 other family members, lived on Knobscot Hill prior to King Philip's War in 1675. Reportedly, they had fruit orchards and cornfields on the side of the hill, and Jethro's field at Knobscot was mentioned in town records as early as 1649. Tippling Rock, as it is called, on top of Knobscot, may have been used to communicate between local native villages. Located over 600 feet above sea level, the rock is the highest point on the Sudbury portion of Knobscot Hill. Mount Wachusett was and still is visible from the rock. And of course, Wachusett itself comes from the Nipmuc language and is believed to mean near the mountain or mountain place. The mountain itself was an area used for hunting, and like other places with a higher elevation, was and is considered a sacred place by the Nipmuc people. Now, local legends and folklore say that the natives moved the boulder on top of Knobscot Hill back and forth as a means of communication. The boulder on top of the outcropping was used to tipple or rock it back and forth. Thus, Native Americans would tipple it to send sound through the rock for communication. Regardless of this ridiculous name in folklore, it is likely that the rock was used by the Nipmuc for an advantageous view of the countryside. If local farmers were impressed by the rock's native connection and history, they didn't act like it. And the rock shows evidence of wedge or drill holes, and local historians have proposed that the rock was blasted in the early part of the 20th century. Others have speculated that a farmer leasing the field may have blasted the rock because he was afraid that the cows could be injured by it. And another theory is the rock was split to make a millstone. And there were also further attempts to destroy parts of the rock in the 1930s. The Nipmuc would have had sporadic contact with traders and fishermen from Europe prior to colonization. And the earliest known contact between Nipmuc and the English was possibly in 1621 at what is now Sterling, Massachusetts. The Nipmucs initially had friendly relations with the English, and the Nipmuc themselves even tell the story of one instance when a man called Aquatimog walked from his home village of Wabaquasit in present Worcester County to Boston, carrying corn to the starving colonists. It is estimated that there were 5,000 to 6,000 Nipmucks when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620. And the majority of the Nipmuc population lived along the rivers and streams connected to the Blackstone, Quabog, Nashua, and Quinnebog rivers. Like most New England tribes, the Nipmuc preferred settled village life over a nomadic existence. Elevation, as well as nearby forests and streams, were all deciding factors in where they would settle. As I mentioned earlier, the people would not spend an entire year at one particular site, but would move around according to the seasons. They lived primarily in dwellings that were called witus, a structure that was known as a wigwam by the Abenaki and a wickiup by the Ojibwe. Made of bark and tree saplings, the structures were easy to assemble and disassemble and easy to transport to and from their seasonal camps. According to the West Brookfield Historical Commission, the Nipmuc were never exclusively nomadic and settled themselves according to a very deliberate seasonal schedule. By the time the Europeans arrived, the Nipmucs were living in semi-permanent villages and were cultivating the land with primarily maize, beans, and squash. European settlers arriving in Massachusetts after 1620 encountered a severely depleted native population. Europeans had been making their way to North America for 100 years before colonization, with French fishermen arriving at the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in 1504 and Portuguese fishermen arriving 2 years later. English fishermen soon followed, and these visitors brought with them diseases to which the natives had no immunity, including smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, cholera, and even bubonic plague. Of course, the first permanent English settlement in the region did not begin until after the settling of Plymouth Colony in 1620. Maine's Passamaquoddy natives were among the first New England natives to make contact with Europeans, and they were devastated by a typhus epidemic in 1586. And in 1616, a horrific plague swept through coastal Massachusetts, but it's still not clear to historians what it was. Perhaps smallpox, perhaps yellow fever, perhaps bubonic plague. Regardless of the disease, the English interpreted the disappearance of the native population as part of a divine plan to clear the land for Puritan settlement. King James I would announce, quote, "These late years there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so as there is not left any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. We, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us, have thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of ours," unquote. And in the 1640s, an English settler named Daniel Denton would record, quote, "Strangely, they have decreased by the hand of God, and it hath generally been observed that where the English come to settle, a divine hand makes way for them." Now, according to early English accounts, the first settlers of Sudbury in 1638 had good relations with the Native American families living there. The land occupied by these settlers was purchased from a local Nipmuc man named Cato, also spelled Carta, K-A-R-T-E, either individually or with his brothers. And because of this, he was given the colonial title of respect and rank of Goodman by the Sudbury settlers. Goodman Cato and his family lived on what is still called Goodman's Hill in Sudbury. In 1661, John Howe was granted a license for a public house in Marlborough, Massachusetts. This became known as the Black Horse Tavern. According to a book called Among Old New England Inns by Mary Caroline Crawford from 1907, the proximity of Howe's Tavern to the Indian plantation, quote, brought him into intimate contact with the natives, and he soon won their confidence and goodwill by his uniform kindness. Once he settled a dispute regarding a pumpkin vine which sprang up on the premises of one Indian while bearing its fruit upon that of another. In an impressive statesmanlike manner, and calling for a knife, he divided the pumpkin squarely in half, giving equal portions to each claimant. As if the poor Native Americans could not figure out how to cut a pumpkin in half and share it. John Howe's grandson, David, would receive the land where the Wayside Inn now sits from his father in 1702. In 1716, the Sudbury selectmen would grant David Howe, quote, to keep a house of entertainment for travelers, and that public house would eventually become what is now the Wayside Inn. It should be noted that in some of the materials that I looked through in the Wayside archives, David Howe was mentioned, quote, as an Indian ranger, and that his, quote, awareness of constant danger at their very doorstep built a strong tradition of Indian service in the Howe family. Needless to say, this Indian service was fighting against the native tribes of the Sudbury area, and David's uncle, Colonel Thomas Howe, has gone down in Sudbury records as, quote, an Indian fighter. Perhaps the best known Nipmuc leader of the Sudbury area was a man called Tantamouse, who I mentioned before. He has gone down in history as a wise man, a holy man, a healer, and a shaman. And he was no doubt an important figure to the Nipmuc and a man that the Puritans took seriously. And he was given the name Jethro by the early settlers. And I had to look this up. In the Bible, Jethro was a wise elder and advisor to Moses. So Jethro was definitely a name of honor to Tantamouse. He was one of the natives that was present at the so-called Sale of Concord in 1635, and it seems that he had good relations with the English until King Philip's War. At the start of the war in 1675, friendly relations between the English settlers and most of the native population all but broke down, and the war itself was devastating to the Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Podunk, and Narragansett peoples. Already decimated by disease, it is estimated that the total population of New England's tribes dropped to around 10,000 people by 1675. And the war led to the death and enslavement of thousands of natives. The Narragansett, Wampanoags, Podunks, and Nipmucs suffered substantial losses. Several smaller bands were all but eliminated, and even the Mohegans, who sided with the English, were greatly weakened by the war. And for those of you that don't really know, King Philip's War, as it was called by the English, began in 1675 when an alliance of Native Americans formed by the Wampanoag Sachem Metacom attempted to eliminate the colonial settlers of New England. And with that, the natives hoped to regain control of their former lands, continue their culture without outside interference, and put an end to the poor treatment they were receiving from the English authorities and settlers. The Native Alliance had some victories, notably a Sudbury fight in April 1676, in which some 500 Nipmucs, Narragansett, and Wampanoags attacked Sudbury. But ultimately, the war would go badly for Metacomet's alliance. After the conflict ended in 1678, the tribes were faced with the continuing erosion of their sovereignty, the loss of their lands, and the decline of their communities. And it's estimated that some 5,000 natives died in the war. Along with the deaths of 2,500 English, King Philip's War can be considered one of America's most devastating conflicts. Now, King Philip's real name was Metacom or Metacomet or Pometacom, depending on who you talk to. And he was the Sachem in the Wampanoag people and the second son of the famed Massasoit who helped the Pilgrims. He would not only he would not be the only tribal leader to unite a confederation of tribes in order to fight the English and later American encroachment onto native lands. An Ottawa named Pontiac would create a pan-Indian resistance movement against European colonization in the Midwest in 1763. And the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh would lead a similar resistance movement in the Great Lakes region in the early 19th century. And starting with Metacomet, all of these movements had one thing in common. It was Native people taking control of their lives and destiny in the hopes of getting rid of the European invaders. And so King Philip was just the first of these Native American freedom fighters, as I like to call him. Sadly, he was killed on August 12, 1676 in Bristol, Rhode Island. But what of Tantamouse, our local leader? During the war, he and his family, along with hundreds of other natives, were sent to an internment camp on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. Some 500 to 1,000 men, women, and children of the Nipmuc and other tribes were left on the island with inadequate food, shelter, or clothing. One English visitor to the island would report, quote, "The island was bleak and cold, their wigwams poor and mean, their clothes few and thin." Well over half of the prisoners would perish during the winter of 1675-1676. Miraculously, Tantamouse himself would actually escape the island by swimming across Boston Harbor, only to be recaptured and executed on Boston Common on September 26, 1676. Another Nipmuc leader I would like to talk about was the son of Tantamouse. His name, he goes by various names, but he was known as Hantamush, and he was given the Christian name of Peter Jethro. And he is remembered in Sudbury history as a scribe, translator, minister, land proprietor, and praying Indian affiliated for a period with John Eliot in the praying town of Natick, Massachusetts. I should do another brief aside. Beginning in 1652, Reverend John Eliot, a Puritan missionary, began to convert the peoples of various Massachusetts tribes to Christianity. These quote unquote praying Indian converts would be separated from their non-Christianized tribal members and relocated in what became known as praying towns. The first such town was in Natick, Massachusetts, and some of the other towns were in Grafton, Webster, and Dorchester, Massachusetts. In these towns, the Native people were forbidden to practice their traditional ways. They had to wear English-style clothes, live in English-style homes, and attend church services. So the question is, why would they become Christianized? And the answer is for a number of reasons. First, for protection from attacks by other tribes that were not Christianized. They were probably also curious about the Puritans and their English ways. They joined because of economic survival, perhaps education, and also the availability of food and clothing. These were all factors in why Native peoples voluntarily moved to the praying towns. Now, I could go on. The so-called praying Indians is a subject worth exploring on its own, and it would be a whole talk unto itself. However, for our purposes, it should be noted that Tantamouse never chose to be Christianized. By 1635, Peter Jethro, his son, was living in Neshoba near Nagog Pond on the modern-day boundary of Littleton and Acton. And like his father, he was present at the sale of what is now downtown Concord. Around 1650, he was Christianized and he moved to the praying town of Natick, near where his father was living on Knobscot Hill in Sudbury. While in Natick, Peter Jethro studied under the Reverend John Eliot, who stated, quote, "Jethro, after he had confessed Christ and was baptized, was sent to preach Christ." So basically, he became a missionary. In 1674, Daniel Gookin, the superintendent of the praying Indians, personally vouched for Peter Jethro as being a, quote, "grave and pious Indian," and he also commissioned him to work as a missionary minister in Nashaway, which was in Lancaster, and Weshakim, which is in Sterling, Massachusetts. Peter Jethro was bilingual, and using his knowledge of English and local Algonquin dialects, he served as a translator and scribe for various land transactions between settlers and Native Americans in Massachusetts. In 1665, he was part of a group of natives that transferred Quinnamog Pond to the settlers. During King Philip's War in Massachusetts, the government here ordered Peter's father, Tantamouse, and his family to Deer Island, as I already mentioned, and Tantamouse escaped. But here's where Peter Jethro becomes something of a villain, at least to some people. He alerted the authorities with assurances that his family would not be harmed of his father's whereabouts, who was hiding with other Native Americans and captured in Dover, New Hampshire, and he was executed on Boston Common. In the history of the war, Increase Mather referred to the incident stating, quote, that abominable Indian Peter Jethro betrayed his own father and other Indians of his special acquaintance unto death. But I have to wonder if Peter Jethro was really the bad guy here. Some historians believe that he was lied to by the New Hampshire colonial leader, Richard Waldron, who promised that Tantamouse and the other natives would be captured, but not harmed. And it was reported that various tribes never forgave Waldron for his deception. Personally, I feel that Peter Jethro was doing what he thought best, hoping that his father and the rest of his family would be spared. After King Philip's War between 1681 and 1685, Peter Jethro became an advocate for the Native Americans. He signed documents with other Nipmucs protesting the sale of tribal lands, including what is near now Marlborough, Massachusetts, and elsewhere in Nipmuc country. In 1683, several Nipmucs sent a petition to John Eliot requesting that church services in the Natick praying towns continue in the Nipmuc language rather than English, and one of the signers was Old Jethro. And he may have been using his father's name after his father's death, or he may have adopted it, as was the practice among natives in the area. He also continued to work with the English settlers. In 1684, he confirmed land transfers of family land in Sudbury to colonists, and he deeded land into what is now Maynard to settlers there. He also signed documentation in 1684 confirming early land transfers, including the Concord Purchase, and it seems that he was also involved in land transfers in places as far away in what is now Vermont. And after that, he just simply disappears from history. According to one source, in the fall of 1688, Peter Jethro and 3 other Indians went on an excursion to the upper valley of the Connecticut River, the object of which is not stated. No later notice of him has been found. So what about now? While Peter Jethro may have disappeared from history, the people we call Native Americans have not. But here we are well into the 21st century, and we still have a lot to learn about the native peoples of not only Massachusetts, but also of North America. Perhaps the biggest misconception is that these tribes are extinct, that they no longer exist. And of course, this could not be farther from the truth. While it is true that catastrophic population losses due to contact with Europeans through disease, warfare, and enslavement would continue into the 19th and even the 20th centuries, many of the native peoples would survive the taking of their lands and the decimation of their way of life. Indeed, they not only survived, but they are still with us. The Massachusetts, Nauset, Nipmuc, Pennacook, Pocumtuck, Stockbridge, and Wampanoag peoples are still in Massachusetts. Since I focused on the Nipmuc in my talk, I would like to finish up with a little bit about the Nipmuc tribe in the 21st century. There are 500 or so Nipmuc living in Massachusetts today, and the center of their tribal organization is in Grafton, Massachusetts. As it says on their website, the community centers on our historic reservation, approximately 3.5-acre property located within the town of Grafton, Massachusetts. The reservation is unique in Massachusetts for never having been owned or occupied by non-native people. What began as an allotted land in a Nipmuc township transformed over the centuries to a traditional cultural property and symbol of tribal persistence and continuity. I like that. Tribal persistence and continuity. That phrase describes not only the Nipmucs, but all native tribes in North America. Continuity is the important word here. They were never gone. They were never extinct. Massachusetts was and still is Indian land. Thank you very much.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about there, Richard. Thank you so much. I am going to move over to the chat so that we can make sure that we get people's questions answered. So we have a little bit of time. So I'm going to just jump in. Very early on in your talk, and you did talk about Knobscot Mountain, but somebody had asked, are there places one might be able to see, or maybe you want to approach it from where could someone visit to see evidence of the indigenous inhabitants? Would you recommend? Where do people go in Sudbury?
Yeah, on Knobscot Hill, there are supposedly signs, there are grinding stones, and other things like that left behind. So sadly, a lot of the native artifacts that have been discovered, some of them have disappeared. We don't know where they are. The Sudbury Historical Society has a very fine collection of archaic and woodland stone tools and spear points and things like that. The Concord Museum has an amazing collection of Native American artifacts. So going out to actual places, especially in a town like Sudbury, it's pretty built up already and has been that way since the 17th and 18th century. So it's not like you can walk around and go, oh, that looks like it did in 1635. So you kind of have to dig literally and figuratively to find Native American sites. Absolutely.
Thank you. And also early on, a question was asked about the species of wild plants that would have been gathered for food, medicine, and building material. And just as a review, because people were coming in a little bit later, can you sort of run through those? Or
sure, we know there was a various form of wild rice that was growing in the area, in the swampy areas, cattails, reeds. They could all be used for bedding, for clothing, for weaving baskets and whatnot. So they were really using a lot of the wild native plants, not only for clothing and food and bedding, but also for medicine, things like that. So they were literally using everything that was growing around them, mostly in the swampy areas. When I was doing the research, I was really surprised to find out and read that the swamps were really that important to the native people. They seemed to get a lot more of their food from the swampy areas than they did from the forests. They were really living on the amphibians and the smaller animals and the reptiles, getting those from the swamps more than the big game that they would be getting from the woods.
And then the next question, are there any estimates of how long the Nipmuc people had lived in the area prior to the 17th century? Do you know?
Yeah, I talked about it a little bit. They estimate that at least the artifacts that were found on the Wayside property, they estimate that there were people there for about 2,000 years. So, and some estimates say that they may have been here even farther back than that. So I want to say safely, I can say safely at least 2,000 years, maybe a little bit longer.
Okay. We had questions as well. I think you covered, but how King Philip obtained his name.
Right. And, you know, and that's the one thing that I wanted to really do in this talk is I wanted to not use their English names or their Christian names and try to use their real names as much as possible. But again, a lot of the information that we have comes from English sources. So a lot of times there are 2 or 3 different spellings of some of these people's names. Either they're being spelled phonetically, or they misheard the way that they were pronounced, or they didn't understand the native language. So, you know, I tried to at least be faithful in some ways to the way some of these names would have been pronounced. I hope I did a good job.
We have another question. How easily were Indian converts and their descendants able to assimilate into European colonial society? Was there, oh, sorry, I have to scroll here. Was their conversion seen as enough? Or did their native ancestry follow them long after? How would you reply to that?
Well, if their Christianity was seen as enough to help them assimilate into English society, no. In fact, during King Philip's War, a lot of the so-called praying Indians were the ones that were rounded up and put onto Deer Island. They even though they were Christianized, a lot of the English settlers didn't necessarily trust them, and so whether they were Christianized or not didn't seem to really affect the way people were reacting to them.
Okay. In the chat, people are mentioning that there's another grinding stone as well, which is up on Green Hill Road. It is on private property, but the Historical Society does weed around it to
Right.
maintain it, so you can go visit that.
I was a little afraid to mention that because it is on private property.
They're aware, yeah.
Yes, as always, ask permission before you start wandering on somebody's land.
Yeah. From Bill Andreas, who's an archaeologist, the most recent archaeological dig in Sudbury was in the Assabet River National Wildlife Reservation. I don't know what NWR is, Bill. There's a nice display of material found in the visitor center there.
Actually, yeah, you're right. That is a great display over there. Absolutely. Yeah, the Assabet River trustees do an incredible job. And the visitor center over there has an excellent collection. Absolutely.
We have a question on how to spell Jethro's native name.
Let me find it. I can give you 2 different spellings if I can go through here real quick and see. Peter Jethro, the 2 spellings are, I need to put my glasses on for this. Okay, the first way is Animatohu, Animatohu, and Hantomush, Hantomush.
Okay,
Those are the 2 spellings that I found or that I've seen.
thank you.
And I'm sorry if I'm butchering those.
We have a question. Can you say a little bit more about the 1970s archaeological dig at the Wayside?
Yeah, so funny you should ask that. So I have here the archaeological report. And so they didn't do a big dig, but what they did find was kind of proof that there were people living here in prehistoric and early historic times. There was kind of a popular misconception for a long time that there were not really native people living on the Wayside property, or they weren't really around that much in Sudbury. And so this archaeological dig kind of proved to people that yes, there were natives here. The problem with the Wayside area was that it's been compromised since the 17th century by the English settlers. The fact that it was an inn so early in Sudbury history, the land has always been used by the English settlers and later the American settlers. So it was hard to, from what I've read from this report, it was hard going trying to find a good area that was not compromised already, because it was such a settled area. So what they did find were these spear points, and I know that Tanya is watching, and she's definitely was involved with it. But if she's here and she can chime in, feel free, Tanya, to turn on your mic and talk a little bit more about it if you want to do that. But it really kind of, the stuff that they found at least proved that there were people here. And I think that's the important part of the dig, that there were people living on the Wayside site.
Well, since I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Richard. That was a good presentation. That's just one small picture of native habitation in this area. I know on the Wayland side of the river, we've had habitation going back to 8,000 years, 7 for sure, and possibly 8, because we've had artifacts from those time periods turn up. But you were absolutely right that Sudbury has been very developed, and the English picked the same kinds of properties as the native people did and built their homes on those. So they would have totally obliterated any earlier evidence of native people. But the dig behind the Wayside Inn, of course, that property is totally not there anymore. And I think a septic system was built on this same property.
Right.
We dug 5-foot squares, which was a pretty large square for how archaeologists do things now. And I did not see, with my limited experience at that time, that was my very first dig, I really didn't see much disturbance where we were digging. I don't remember, unless after maybe some other days when people were there, more European or modern goods turned up, but I don't remember very much of that when I was there. So
Great. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much.
and I do want to correct something. Somebody said it. I don't know how to use a chat, to be honest with you. But somebody said that, well, they didn't know the name of the person who organized and supervised the dig. That was Michael Fear, and he was a teacher at the Sudbury Regional School. And he had experience as an archaeologist. He had a degree in anthropology, and he was just a wonderful guy to work with and for and to learn from. So that's really a lot of what I remember about it. It was so long ago.
Well, I'm glad you were here to answer that question for me.
Thank you. You got us started, Tanya.
I should say that when I first started with this position and with this research, Katina and I had a wonderful lunch at the Wayside Inn with Tanya. And it was I was like writing page after page after page after page from like the minute she started talking. So yeah, a lot of this talk is because of the things that I learned from Tanya. Thank goodness.
Lucky to have Tanya as a resource. If I look to the right over to the chat again, we do have more questions if you're up for it. You had the person asking the question said you had mentioned that violent conflict was more common among tribes on the coastline than it was for the Nipmuc or other inland tribes. Were there particular economic or geographic reasons for this?
Yeah, from what I know, one of the two of the most powerful tribes were the Pequot and the Mohegan, and they, from what I understand and what I've read and the research that I've done over the years about them, they kind of like to. they like to take over land as well. They wanted to get as much land as they could. And even for a while, the Pequot, from what I've read, the Pequot were kind of in control of some of the Nipmuc areas for a while. And the Nipmuc were, every time I would read this, it would say the Nipmuc were subject to the Pequot. So there were issues of intertribal warfare and issues going on, absolutely. So, you know, the idea that it was like one big happy land before the Europeans landed isn't necessarily true. So there were a lot of issues between various tribes. And the Pequot and the Mohegan seemed to be two of the more powerful tribes in the area, and kind of acted like it for a long time.
We have a question, and this is great for reminding us that people may not know what these tools were. So someone's asking, what would a grinding stone be used for?
Oh, so think of a big mortar and pestle. So, and think of a big stone bowl, and that would be the grinding stone, and you would put grain and seeds in there, and you would use it to grind your seeds and your corn into flour and whatnot.
Thank you. We also have had a couple of questions about Weetamoo. Was she from this area or not? She's referenced in Our Beloved Kin. Do you know about Weetamoo?
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I don't, unfortunately.
She was a woman leader over in Rhode Island, I believe. Somebody will probably correct me in the chat there. But I think because she was written about in Our Beloved Kin, I think there's a renewed interest in learning more about her.
I know the name, but I'm sorry, I don't know that much about her, if anything.
She was not local to Sudbury, though. So, okay, so people are asking how to see the archaeological dig report. We do have it now in the Wayside Inn's collection, our archives. We have a question. Do we know the DNA history of the Nipmuc people and where people are living today? You had referenced Grafton, but do you want to just say that again?
Yeah, the DNA I do not know, but so the Grafton reservation that they have, as I mentioned, and they're very proud of the fact that it's always been owned by and run by the Nipmuc people themselves. It's it's 3.5 acres compared to what they once lived on, but the fact that they have their own cultural center, the Nipmuc website that I follow, I think it's nipmucnation.org, is a font of knowledge about the Nipmuc people and what they've been doing since the 17th century, the history they have on there. In fact, I just read today that there were Nipmuc in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Black regiments during the Civil War, which I definitely need to look into. So yeah, they're still here, but I don't know anything about the DNA or anything like that. I'm sorry.
I'm glad you mentioned soldiers. We had a question, were the Nipmucs part of the alliance that the Constitution was based on?
I don't think so. I think that was mostly Iroquois, if I remember correctly. So it would have been the tribes that belonged to the Iroquois. So Iroquois, Huron, Mohican. I can't remember the other. So I think the Constitution was that was based on the Iroquois peoples. So that's more of the New York area. And
friend Daphne came to the rescue with Weetamoo. She's from Tiverton, Rhode Island. So
okay,
I knew that direction. So,
so
good. We can look into her more as well. Okay. I'm trying to decipher. Follow-up question, if there's time. The person writing the question is saying, I'm fairly familiar with the coastal conflict. This person's from New London, Connecticut, was interested in the specific conflict and interactions between the Nipmuc and the, I'm not going to say that right, Haudenosaunee Mohican on the western frontier and Abenaki on the northern frontier. Do you know anything about that?
I'm looking at it right now. Let me see. Yeah, unfortunately, again, I'm not that familiar with that particular conflict either.
Okay.
So before we wrap up,
Yeah, I'm at the end of the questions.
what I would like to do, there's a whole bunch of people I would like to thank. So first and foremost, I'd love to thank the Board of Trustees of the Wayside Inn Foundation. The two people that I've worked with on this, both Sally Purrington Hild and Katina Fontes, you have been so welcoming and helpful with this talk and with the work that I've been doing. Lauren Prescott, who is the archivist at the Wayside, opened up the archives to me, and that was awesome. Rachel Robinson, the director of the Sudbury Historical Society, was really helpful with everything she did. Tanya Largy, who we just talked to, was incredible. And Rebecca Cutting was another person that Sally hooked me up with. And we had a really nice conversation, and I learned a lot from her as well. So for all of you who have helped me with this talk and put this together, I really appreciate it. And I absolutely thank everybody who joined us here today as well.
Well, we can't thank you enough, Richard. This was wonderful. I have a lot more research to do following up. The recording will be up on our YouTube eventually, so please share it with other people. We want this information to get out there. Katina, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to jump in here and just I took a few notes of things that people were asking about, but I also just want to say thank you, Richard. It's been such a pleasure working with you, and for the wonderful presentation. It's really been, we had a good time. So
We did have a good time.
We all learned a lot and we had a good time. Want to thank Sally for moderating. This is always like, I kind of say you're really good at this, so I really appreciate you handling all the questions. Thank you to our audience. We've actually kind of broken a record. We had over 113 participants, but we don't know how many were actually watching because sometimes it's more than one person. We had over 200 people sign up, so it's pretty amazing. We've been overwhelmed with just the interest in the topic and people's willingness to learn more about this and to kind of help us on our journey, because we really hope to continue this project and this research to learn as much as we can about the history of our site in its totality.
Well, I think we've really just scratched the surface, and there's a lot more that we can and will be able to do, I think.
Yeah, so thank you for kind of getting us started and getting us going in the right direction, because it's, you kind of laid the groundwork. So it's really been helpful. I also just wanted to, a few people asked about the video. I am the one who usually edits the video recording. I try to put it up within a week or two. It takes a little bit of time to kind of tweak and get just right onto YouTube. I will send it out to everyone who registered for this program, and then it's available for public viewing also. The report for the archaeological dig, I can try and share that with everyone in some sort of PDF format in a shared drive, but I have to talk to Sally about that. But if we can, we'll share it with you. And then I highly recommend Our Beloved Kin. Excellent book. Lisa Brooks talks about Weedamoo. Wanted to just kind of throw a plug for that out there. I also wanted to let everyone know that we are collaborating with a couple of representatives of both the Nipmuc and the Mashpee Wampanoag on some future collaborations. So this project, Richard's work, has kind of helped us move in that direction of doing future programs and future work. So it's been really wonderful for that too. And so last thing, just want to say, stay tuned for some other programs that we have coming up. We're getting ready to unveil an exhibit on Jerusha Howe. We've been working really hard on that, Sally and I, and our archivist, Lauren Prescott. It's getting there. It'll be ready soon. We also have a foraging walk-in workshop on April 30th. Very limited space, but it's with the amazing local gardener and food writer, Karen Bento. So stay tuned for information on that. Other than that, I don't know if Sally or Richard, you had to add anything else you wanted to add?
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight, and thank you so much for all your help. It was great. Thank you so much.
Richard. Thank you. We appreciate it. Have a good night.